Then we will be hello everybody, welcome to our Thursday celebration. And instead of calling it a book launch, we have several books that we'll be celebrating, but mainly we're celebrating the poet, the person, Allison Joseph, and that is why all of us are here tonight to really take a moment to thank her for not only being a stellar poet whose poems really move us, but being an amazing pillar of our poetic community. And if you missed the conversation, I'm sorry, but I would suggest on Facebook, find her and find some of the groups that she has started, which we just spent time talking about. I'm gonna give a brief bio and then I'm gonna turn it over to Allison. We want to remind people that make sure you mute. And then also, if you'd like to read for open mic, just send me a message and I will put you down on the list. We'd love to have you read a poem. Open mic's been a big part of my pleasure in running this on Thursdays. I also want to remind people to put in any readings that you're hosting. I know Dustin, Wild and Precious, probably has something coming up that we would all like to hear about. And I see that Cal has already put something in there. So please feel free to do that. That keeps us connected and knowing what else is out there. So a little bit about Allison Joseph, if you happen to be someone that doesn't know her. Allison Joseph lives in Carbondale, Illinois, where she is on faculty at Southern Illinois University. Her most recent collections, yes, plural, of poems are Lexicon, which was Redheaded Press in 2021. Any Proper Weave, which was Kelsay Books, 2022. Yes. Speak and Spell, which was Lyre Press, also 2022. And Confessions of a Barefaced Woman, Hen Press, 2018. Just to let you know, Confessions of a Barefaced Woman won 2019 Feathered Quill Book Award and also was a finalist for the 2019 NAACP Awards. And Allison went to that, and I have to tell you, that was I love seeing the photos of that. A very amazing night and well-earned honor. She was named Illinois Author of the Year for 2022 by the Illinois Association of Teachers of English. Her poems have appeared in New York Times and in Best American Poetry Series. She is the widow of beloved poet and editor Jon Tribble. Allison, thank you so much for being here and letting us celebrate with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I apologize for my voice. I've been a little sick. I was away during the last couple of weeks for spring break. Even though I'm on sabbatical, I still went on spring break. So it's I'm a little hoarse, but I'm so thrilled and grateful to be part of this celebration. And the reason that I always end, ever since he passed, I always end my bio with John's name, is that we were Jon and Allison. We were Team Jallison, and anyone who knows me knows that I've been beginning my readings with poems of John's. Jon and I met in Bloomington, Indiana, which is of course where a girl from the Bronx meets a guy from Little Rock, Arkansas. And I know that Jon would be really unhappy with the direction Sarah Huckabee Sanders is moving Arkansas in, because having lived there, it was not a place of hate. It was not a place of singling people out. Of course, we lived in Little Rock. So I want to start by reading a poem of Jon's, and this was Jon's first book, which was published by a publisher we both share, Lyre Press, which is a publisher out of Glenview, Illinois, so Chicago area. And we were a poetry pair. We were two people who our lives revolved around poetry. We didn't have children. And Jon was told early on, he came to poetry from being a fiction writer. He was told early on that he had what was it? Our communal teacher, David Wojan. He was told that he had no music as a poet, so which Jon took to heart and worked very hard as a poet, even though the poems themselves seem effortless. And I wanted to continually remind him that he was a poet, even though we spent a lot of time getting other people into print with Crab Orchard Review, which has been on hiatus since his death, but I hope to revive and bring it back. But one thing I always did was I would remind him in many ways that he was a poet. And one way I would do that was if we were in some place and I saw something that I thought he could write about rather than me, I would tell him to write about it. You know, other wives say like fix the roof and you know, mow the lawn. I was like, no, write this poem. So this is a poem from God of the Kitchen was one of his books. This is a poem from Natural State, which is the slogan for the state of Arkansas. And the backstory to this poem is that we were back in Little Rock, John and I, where his parents lived until quite late in their lives. Later on, they moved out to the DC area. But we both taught at one point at University of Arkansas, Little Rock, but we were no longer teaching there. We were back visiting. But we were near the campus and there was sort of a strip mall, little strip mall area near the campus. It's a very urban campus. And in this strip mall, if I remember correctly, I think there was like a butcher shop and a gentleman's club. And gentleman's club is a euphemism for what we would know as a strip club. And outside the sign, as we passed by that day, said, amateur night, which I found hilarious. Amateur night, and the name of the club was the Prime Time, with time spelled with a Y because it's classier that way, of course. So this book has a lot of Arkansas poems. So when we passed by the Prime Time, I said, who knew this town had so much flesh in it? And I went like this to John. I said, you have to use that line. You have to use that. You've been in there. Because he'd been in there for some sort of bachelor party years ago. So this is his poem thinking about what would drive a woman to participate in amateur night at the Prime Time. So it's called Amateur Night at the Prime Time. And there are a couple of Arkansas town names in it, Malvern, El Dorado, and the Mad Butcher is a supermarket. Amateur Night at the Prime Time by Jon Tribble. Who knew this town had so much flesh in it? The dancer drops her head between her legs, and men who can't afford another drink reach deep to come up with a couple of bucks to get her to remove another shred of pink, rip away t-shirt clinging to her shoulders, like junk mail poking from the lip of a mailbox at an abandoned apartment she left in Malvern or El Dorado. There is only so much one can pay to see, but tonight it's here, where leftover green beer goes for $8 a pitcher, stale popcorn and peanuts $2.50 a basket. But it's not sustenance they come for unless to feed a lonely imagination or half-forgotten lust. Free to anyone who's paid the membership fee at the door. Tomorrow, she might be checking out customers at the Mad Butcher or stocking shelves at 7-Eleven. She could be calling from Sears or flipping burgers at Dairy Queen. Whatever she wakes for to pay the bills and rent, invisible behind a smile or a frown, cheerful hello or impersonal grunt. Now she's more spectacle than any daylight life could shadow. The thong of her G-string disappearing before the mirror of blank faces that give back only their reflections. Wives and girlfriends and magazines and passing glances staring through the gyrations, shimmering from lubricious skin, jiggling along to the forgettable music. One thing I love about that poem is giving people that, you know, are often overlooked an inner life. And I think that's one of the great things that writers can do. It's like people who are overlooked and undervalued, we give them life. And another thing about my relationship with Jon. Oh, I'm so glad to see that, Cindy, that you were a fan of Jon's work. I was a fan of Jon's work too. Another thing about my relationship with Jon was that he put up with my non-driving ass for, decades. I never learned to drive. And when I attempted to learn as an adult, I crashed the driver's ed vehicle. So I took that as a sign that I probably shouldn't operate a motor vehicle. So I get around through a cunning strategy of trains, planes, Ubers, and the love of people who want to share my company. But I often find myself in places, in weird ass places. I often find myself waiting. So this is a poem that comes from this new chapbook, newish. I think, and you can correct me on this if you wish, but I think any book that you publish that's 2 years old and under is still a new book, particularly with the last couple of years, a lot of us not being able to promote our books in person. So I'm still going to think of this as a new book. And speaking of local sources, this sucker, I thought he was so beautiful, or she was so beautiful. This moth was hanging out at my local liquor store, so I'm responsible for the cover art. So I'm going to read a few poems from this. So since I don't drive, I'm always waiting. I'm waiting for buses, for trains, for planes. So this is called Woman Waiting. And there's a lot of repetition. My modus operandi often as a poet is to repeat myself, hoping maybe they'll like it better the next time I say it. So, Woman Waiting. I'm waiting in the airport for the hour of redemption. Heavy baggage for the journey, waiting me at the wrist. I'm waiting in the train station for a minute of consolation, watching arrivals and departures with a tattered schedule. I'm waiting in the supermarket for a fraction of compassion, briefest eye contact exchanged for my change. I'm waiting in the hospital for a sliver of insight, all those numbers on my chart, some headache I can't read. I'm waiting in the bus depot for a diagram of empathy, some chart of all the routes to make a clean escape. I'm waiting in the alleyway for a gram of grace, some bit of exaltation to keep me from my own throat. I'm waiting in the settlement for a flask of fantasy, some deep draught I cannot help choke down. I'm waiting in the bathroom for an inch of lucidity, some scrap of rest unknown to any mirror. I'm waiting in the orchard for a jigger of gratitude, some split of land unfettered by the bruises of weather. I'm waiting in the graveyard for a flash, a siren, a signal, for confirmation this world is more than anticipation, more than this mourning, collapsing and unraveling, never adding up to any proper weave. So as an African-American woman poet, I am often asked, do I write political poems? Well, look at me. Do I look like the kind of person who would write political poems? The answer is, if I write about my life, I end up writing a political poem. And one of the things, being someone who has loved literature all her life, I was that nerdy kid in the library reading poems that she wasn't assigned to read in school. You often stumble upon racism in places you don't expect it. So I have frequently taught for my graduate students here at SIU a sort of world survey of poems, poetry, poets that you hear about and you're expected to have knowledge of, like people like Neruda, Verlaine, Apollinaire, and you're like, I haven't actually read them. So I was reading Verlaine, and I came upon this passage in Verlaine that made me angry. And the passage is the epigraph for this poem, and the poem is called "To Answer Verlaine," because you always have to talk back to poems that engage you in good and bad ways. So the epigraph is, and of course this is a translation, the epigraph is, what mad Negro or tone-deaf child created this penny jewel, this crime that rings hollow, false under the file? I'm like, Verlaine, what gives? Like, you knew Negroes. So here's the poem, To Answer Verlaine. This mad Negro has skills you and all those pasty symbolists better recognize. Music in my very walk, my laughter like Langston's. I have my gaudy jewels, shiny dime store pendants, cubic zirconia rings, my sold on late night television, phony diamond earrings. And I make them look good, strutting without a stutter, striding in my own glistening skin. My only crime was to be born in this subtle and shaded hue, born to marvel at curious things until I had to write them down, ringing with the very sound of verse, a kind of molten dignity even a mad Negro could recognize, even on the edge of sanity. Knife slice of all that enmity, all those ugly scratches history etched onto my eyeballs. Far from false, but still in your files, a literary suspect, accessible wreck, baby girl not fit for the captain's table. Riddle me this, Verlaine. How many poets does it take to stop a war, to broker a peace, to cut a piece of any reader's heart, swallow it whole, and live? I don't know if you know how it truly feels to be mad, angered under the surface of myriad subtleties, while another campus rages and a city blisters with gunfire. I'd like to offer you any one of a dozen seats. Invite you to listen while I switch my style. Silence when I spit it out. Now, I love writing a poem like that because I can embed all sorts of literary and musical references in it. And there are references that in this poem. Of course, I mentioned Langston Hughes because Langston Hughes is one of my touchstones, one of the earliest poets that I embraced. And there's a reference to myriad subtleties, which comes from Paul Laurence Dunbar. And also, listen while I switch my style, silence while I spit it out is a paraphrase of Missy Elliott, one of my favorites. I think she's a poet. I love Missy Elliott. So I just love indulging myself that way when I write, that I get to put things in poems that amuse me. And let me, hold up. The last of that cold. I often write poems that are considered feminist. I have no problem being called a feminist poet either. I write specifically often to girls, to young women, because I am not anybody's mother. Jon and I did not have children, but I've spent a lot of my time with other people's children and seeing them go from being girls to women, So This is a poem of mine called Ego Training, Advice for Girls and Women. And this is advice I have to give to myself, particularly now that I'm a widow. Widowhood has been this very strange territory for me. I was partnered to Jon for 31 years, 27, almost 28 of them married. So widowhood has been this very strange, painful, and actually sometimes very humorous. But I have to give myself this advice. So it's called Ego Training, Advice for Girls and Women. And it is a variation for the formalists out there. It's a variation on a villanelle called a terzinelle. So a terzinelle is a villanelle crossed with terzerima. Ego Training, Advice for Girls and Women. When someone asks too much of you, say no. When strangers ask for favors, hesitate. Don't go to places you don't want to go. Walk tall, head up, eyes front. Keep walking straight past men who whistle threats at you, then smile. When strangers ask for favors, hesitate. Say you'll get back to them, then wait a while. Don't slouch or sink into your bones. Glide tall past men who whistle threats at you. Don't smile. Give what you want to give, but don't give all. Keep part of you intact, untouched, pristine. Don't slouch or sink into your bones. Glide tall. Strut if you like. And don't think it's obscene to like yourself when others call you weak. Keep part of you intact, untouched, pristine, but speak your mind, not timid, scared, or meek. When someone asks too much of you, say no. To like yourself when others call you weak, don't go to places you don't want to go. Yeah, that's some good advice, particularly handling the opposite sex now that I'm single. I think I'll read one more poem. Is that okay? Okay. This is a poem that's very rhymey because it's a pantoum, but it's a poem that I read in wake of what we've all been through communally and individually. I know that for a lot of people going back, I didn't go to AWP. I hope to be in Kansas City. But for a lot of people, it was like just seeing someone they hadn't seen in 3 years. Just like, okay, we're touching base. I see you. So I read this poem a lot at readings, just sort of, touch. Are you okay? Are you doing okay? And the title is After Surfacing. I know everybody thinks of Margaret Atwood as the author of The Handmaid's Tale, but there's her book Surfacing. I was referring to it. After Surfacing. So how are you coping with all that's gone wrong? Indulging in doping or crafting a song? With all that's gone wrong, why fight for what's right? Indulging and hoping these wrecks will be slight. Why fight for what's right? Why bother at all? These wrecks will be slight, surviving the fall. Why bother at all? Why wake up and rise? Surviving the fall means hearing those lies. Why wake up and rise? World slaps you back down. And hearing their lies, you know you're not sound. World slaps you back down when you're on your feet. You know you're not sound and you feel each defeat. When you're on your feet and flailing about, you feel each defeat. and each stinging doubt. And flailing about, you feel where you break. With each stinging doubt, you harness each ache. You feel where you break, indulging and hoping. You harness each ache, each lesson in coping. Thanks so much for listening.
Oh my gosh, I need that on a poster. People, y'all can unmute so that we can just spend a moment to say, holy smokes.
Holy smokes.
Holy smokes. Wow.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, you should see what's flapping into the meeting, the chat section. I mean, yeah, Cindy, you are such a, Cindy wrote, you are such a passionate poet and a strong person, Allison. Yeah. And Christy, you feel where you broke. And of course, Dustin, awesome reading. Yeah, that form, I love that you use form and then don't. And when you do, there's a reason. It just adds to the impactfulness of the poem. And I just wonder, I have questions about your process and how you go about this, because the range of your abilities is very impressive. And I kind of want to know your thoughts behind how you do what you do, really.
Well, my career as a poet spans all sorts of literary trend changes, because I went to graduate school in the early 90s where there was this weird ass tension between people who wrote free verse and formalists, and new formalism was coming up. So I was aware of those tensions. And then I got my job here, and I was handed this class called Forms of Poetry. And I was like, oh shit, I gotta teach people how to write sonnets. Yes, and now the debate is about prose poetry and lyric prose and things like that. For me, it's like, just write it and figure it out later, But I had to become somewhat of an autodidact. Of course, I knew what a sonnet was, but I had to practice. And I think a lot of people get intimidated by the terms of formal poetry, like, what the fuck is a trochee? I can never remember. I remember what an iamb is because I learned to write in iambic pentameter and iambic tetrameter. And I'm like, hey, this is actually pretty easy. So now I teach that class on the regular. I'm not teaching right now because I'm on sabbatical, but I'll be teaching that class again in spring 2024. And, poetry is such a niche occupation and thing, although many people have written poetry. It's just a niche occupation to declare yourself a poet, at least in the United States, as I've found when I've researched for the other class, that world poetry class, that it's not such a niche thing, particularly in Latin American countries. And I guess you get through that oppressive Russian winter by reading and writing poetry. But I found that I became more productive as a poet the more forms I learned how to do. That the things that I thought were intimidating, and I still have my weaknesses. I'm not very good, or I always give people a lecture that I believe, and a lot of people will fight me on this, but I believe that we can write haiku-like poems in English, but we can't actually write haiku in English. And I always give this lecture in class. And, though I know there is a very thriving and large haiku in English scene, I just am not very good at the distilled image in a few lines. I can very much write the American alternative, which is Adelaide Crapsey's Cinquain, which she sort of invented under the influence of Japanese poetry. And if you're familiar with that form, it's a 5-line, 2, 4, 6, 8, 2 syllable count poem. And I can write those because it's 5 lines, not 3. But learning, and of course, again, being married to another poet, and Jon was very much a narrative poet, but he loved the fact that I wrote in form, that I would invent forms. He would adopt some of the forms that I invented and use them in his own practice. So yeah, I just think it's just a matter of practice. And I think the big breakthrough for me was when my father died. I was trying to write sort of your page and a half memory narrative poem, and it just didn't work. And it didn't work until I started writing a sonnet sequence that became my book, My Father's Kites, which is the only way I could write about his death, because we were estranged, and it took the compression of the sonnet for me to be able to speak to that grief. It's interesting what grief does to you as a poet, because I've been writing about losing Jon, and the forms are varied. Some of them are free verse, some of them are sonnets, some of them are varied forms. So, excuse me.
Thank you for, talking onto that. And I mean, it's lovely to hear the backstory of how you ended up teaching that class, and how, and that is something I think at some point on Facebook, I had seen like a list of some of the forms that you had created. And I just got very curious about how that worked in your writing. And I love hearing it. And I've heard other people say that sometimes a form becomes a very important container for, grief is so messy and so all encompassing, and that it sometimes can give people a way to access into poetry that free verse just didn't help with. So that was lovely. And I do have to tell you, the backstories kick ass. Just the moth at the liquor store, and then of course, the stripper clubs. Just love that. Yeah, any proper weave. And I will put some direct links to these recent books. And like I said, there's been a lot that Allison has published in the past few years. If somebody wanted a signed copy, could they reach out to you via your email?
Most definitely, yeah.
So I would recommend, if that's what you would like, to go ahead and reach out to Allison. Does anybody else have any questions about process, or how she created these recent books, or poetry in general, or thoughts or compliments that you want to give?
I have a question about your process. Do you have something that you do specific, like, I don't know if ritual is the right word, but do you have some sort of thing that you do to keep your writing fresh and keep yourself going?
For me, this is my confession. I will write because I bought a new notebook. I still write in longhand mostly. So if I find something pretty like this, I'm like, that's it. That's, and sometimes I'll find that I've written through a notebook and I've totally forgotten. It's like, oh, there are so many poems in random notebooks. And Jon was the exact opposite. He actually wrote in his head. And when he sat down, he would sit down at his computer because he had so many other things he was doing. And he would have already worked out the poem in his head. And he would hear it in his head and then type it out. And he'd hand me the draft. I'm like, I have nothing to say. This is already done. You've already gone through it in your head. And the sad thing was, toward the end of his life, when he had some medical issues, one of the things that was wrong was that he had ringing of the ear. He said, I can't hear my poems. I can't hear my poems. And that was so devastating to him. But I am a sloppy mess. And I keep notebooks in my office at school. I keep notebooks by my bed. There are notebooks all over this place. So I just, and I will just take a phrase that appeals to me and even if I don't get a poem out of it, I'll keep it in a notebook and then might come back to it. But I've never I've never had issues with writer's block, because I think as a child, I have an older sister. As a child, they were tired of listening to it. Was like, so I knew that I wasn't going to get listened to as the last kid in the family, but if I wrote it down, someone might hear it someday.
Oh, another good story. And that made me think about the frame of I Am Waiting, that that kind of almost had like a spell cast to it, the way it was written. And I noticed that with some of your poems, there's this beautiful movement that I feel in my body, and I can't really say specifically why, but it's something about the use of the rhythm and the words that and the slant rhymes and the interior rhymes that really has like a movement of feel in my body.
I'm a frustrated dancer. I would love
that makes sense.
I'm a frustrated everything else. I'm a frustrated singer, dancer, artist, like visual artist, so poetry is my way to keep being an artist, because I suck at everything else.
You also draw in all those elements. So if you think about it, to me, that's so much what why your poetry has so many layers, is that it has a complexity to it of all these other aspirations and interests that filter into poetry. Good for us.
Yeah, I do love that about poetry, that we can suck at everything else, and we can do this. I think of Gwendolyn Brooks passing away at 83, and her daughter Nora putting a pen in her hand as she's passing from one world to the next, so she could write in the next world.
I had not heard that.
Yeah, like athletes have to give it up at 40, and we're just starting at 40.
Isn't it lovely that we could be called a young poet at 50? That's still, you're fine.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, if there's no more questions, we could take a moment just to say thank you so much.
I have a quick question.
Hi,
that's okay. Hi. Just going along with what you were saying, I know you love to travel. I know you like to eat at all different kinds of restaurants. How does that figure in to some of your poetry? Or do you think
wow. Yeah. I like to sample the world's taste. And Jon and I, when we'd go on our road trips, we would like map out where we were going to eat. And actually at AWP, a lot of people would step to Jon and say, okay, so where are we going? Because we knew he would research. And I have some of that. Since his passing, I've spent a lot of time in Chicago, and Chicago's a great food town, particularly if you ignore the traditional things that you're supposed to eat in Chicago. I have been going to Chicago for many years, long before my husband died, and I have had deep dish pizza once.
What about ribs?
I'm not a big barbecue person.
Oh, Chicago's amazing.
But I do know where to get.
Right.
Which is the west side of Chicago, which is where everybody says, oh, that's violent and terrible. It's like, no, that's where the ribs are.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time when I'm in Chicago by Chinatown, so I can just go up and down Wentworth, Archer, and Cermak, and just be as happy as I can be. I'll find the all-you-can-eat sushi places. I'll find some places. And one of the main events of my marriage to Jon was it was either our 15th or 20th anniversary, where we went to San Francisco to restaurant Gary Danko, which is one of those restaurants, and it still may be this way, but this was really pre-internet, where we had to speak to a reservationist months in advance. And I didn't even know this was a job you could hold. You speak to this person and tell them, okay, we're coming. on this date to celebrate our anniversary. We're coming from one of those I states. So this is very important to us. We're coming from one of those flat places, although actually Southern Illinois isn't as flat as the rest of Illinois. It's still relatively flat. Please give us your best. And Jon very patiently called the reservationist at Restaurant Gary Danko. So San Francisco, I haven't been back to California in a while. That's one of my favorite places to experience food culture. Also, I'm originally from New York, so no other pizza will do, which is probably another reason why I've only had deep dish once. Although, unless you're in Connecticut.
New Haven pizza?
Yes.
Frank
yes.
Pepe.
Yes, Frank. I made sure, Marjorie has been to this conference, Poetry by the Sea, founded by the late, great Kim Bridgeford. And I made sure on one of our trips to Poetry by the Sea, which will happen again this May, I made sure that Jon got some Frank Pepe, because I'm like, this is the where it all started.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
Yeah.
And do you find that these make it their way into your poems?
Yeah, I have written quite a few food poems.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Because we have to celebrate the things that are good, particularly when we've been faced with so many strange and odd and terrible things. So we have to celebrate the things that are good too.
I just wanted to add on the discussion of haiku.
Mhm.
Jack Kerouac, some people call them Western haiku,
Yeah,
but Jack
yeah.
Kerouac called them American haiku. When I write haiku, I write American haiku. And one is kicked at the icebox door and missed. It closed anyway. It's my favorite.
I like that one. I admire folks that can write pithy poems, whatever form we're talking about, whether it's haiku or cinquain or loon or anything that's short. So I love that.
Oh gosh, I would not mind seeing Allison Joseph guidebook to forms. just saying. It would be great to see. Well, if there's no more questions, we will head towards open mic. I have, just to run through the list, if I've forgotten you, say something to me. I have Cal, Christy, Julian, Donna, Susanna, and Dawn. And if I missed anybody, let me know. Cal, I'll come to you first, and then
Okay.
Going down the list.
All right. I'm reading a poem from my book. Here's my book. With the artwork by my grandchildren, organized by my daughter. And this is about my father, who was a policeman in the county of Essex in New Jersey, where Newark is the biggest city. And he was in the riots. It's called Newark Riots 1967. My long gone daddy was a big, strong cop on the Newark streets where he grew up, 6'9", 300 pounds. He was dispatched to the riots where his Negro football buddies fired bullets that breezed by his head like bees. I can still see him. He's stunned, sad, ignores the flak, drags victims to sidewalk shelter, sees them as his own teammates themselves. Why are they shooting at me? This is going to change his life. He went from hair trigger to silent. My father wanted to crawl into a hole, too young to retire. Later on, alerted by screams, he becomes a giant icebreaker, rescues a tiny black girl from a frozen pond, almost freezing to death, but no one cares. The sergeant just orders him back to the barracks to change clothes. The girl and her family celebrate on shore. No thank yous. 2 years later, he slipped on an icy patch and hurt his foot chasing a crook, Achilles heel. He was wild with glee. When the authorities determined his injury was bad enough to retire on, And so he did, and sat, thinking he beat the system, doing nothing, waiting for death in his recliner, watching TV, looking at pictures in magazines he couldn't read, sitting in his chair with National Geographic, scared to die alone. Better to slip under the ice quietly, silently preserved, your last yell immortalized in the park by a wooden sign naming the pond after you. But who would read it? The little children throw lines in for catfish. Their mothers grab the dirty fish, clean them, fry them up in oil, and serve them with greens and hush puppies in a home they'll soon have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal. Holy smokes. A couple comments in the chat section. I always like to remind people to head that way after you've read. Christy, I'm coming to you, and I also am muting as Zoom. And Julie, and I'm heading towards you.
Okay, I can't tell. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can hear me. All right. Okay. I don't know why it is that I'm moved to read this poem I'm going to read, except that I'm practically as old as God, and I've lived through a great many fashions having to do with the writing of poetry and embraced them as they came along, I guess. But I'm also a person who, I live in St. Louis now. I've lived here for 21 years, Allison. But I'm a Texan, except I was born in New Mexico. I also lived in North Carolina for 15 years once in my life. So this poem I'm going to read tonight comes out of my Texas roots, and it's called Monumental History, which, if you want a literary reference, is an allusion to Nietzsche. Here in the knife shop, most folks don't worry about the past. August, and we're a good way out to Jacksboro Highway. The heat kills anything that moves. Locked cars have been known to explode. Next door, at the Stonecutters, though, you hear a story worth a walk through goat heads and broken glass, past the cur that chained up in the daytime, who eyes you and growls down a row of blank tombstones. He's hit the end of the chain too many times. Behind the Stonecutter's shack, Robert E. Lee sits in a low chair in the bed of a Model A pickup. It was the present Stonecutter's granddaddy who carved him on order from a town in Missouri. Drove all the way up there and had to bring him back because folks in Missouri wanted Lee on a horse. He's still for sale.
Thank you, Julian. I was talking and didn't realize I was muted. Donna, I'm coming towards you.
Okay, I'm going to do a short one. My husband has always been very self-conscious about his mountain accent, but that's what attracted me to him. So this poem is called 50 Anniversaries. Your voice calls out to me from the other room, steady, liquid, smooth as sloe gin. In this life, much is tired and gray, short on desire, until your words brush my ear and we breathe young again.
Oh, thank you, Donna. That's beautiful. Was that an anniversary gift?
Yeah, it was. Somebody that I've read poetry to for a long time said, why don't you ever write about your husband? So I wrote about my husband.
I love it. Susanna, I'm coming to you.
Thank you, Malika. So this next one, this poem is from my next manuscript, which is coming out in the fall, titled If This Isn't Love. And the part of the skeletal structure of the manuscript are these 13 poems that have been inspired by a Italian telenovela, which has been running in Italy for 26 years. And this is the first of the telenovela poems. I don't spit on the plate where I eat, the son without steady work explains to his worried father in a long-running soap opera, an Italian proverb that sends me to the internet. They drink wine on their patio off the Golfo di Napoli. Yesterday, I was on another patio, a restaurant off Arthur Avenue. A woman with a Bronx accent was so loud, we decided to move inside, where Andrea Bocelli was singing Cante Partero on the mixtape. In Puglia, I heard the song during a church service, loved it so much, I emailed the priest to ask the song's name, carefully checking that my Italian was correct. He never responded. Silly American to email a priest about a pop song of loss and goodbyes. Leaving our patio seats started a movement. The tables emptied out. Everyone then enjoyed their wine in the air conditioning, listening to Andrea Bocelli, except for the loudmouth still on the patio and her friends. When Andrea Bocelli sang in front of the Duomo in Milano during the lockdown, that video with all the silenced cities of the world, music for hope, made everyone cry as if soap were burning their eyes. We watched the death count going up. Watch the Italian family at the center of the telenovela who live in Posillipo overlooking Vesuvius. The purses are big and voluptuous. Everyone is serious. The only one smiling is the girlfriend of the married doctor who wants to rid himself of a stalker wife. The girlfriend likes his new apartment. Her walk is springy. Uh-oh, she's in love. She hasn't a clue. Thank you.
Darn, I'm looking forward to these ones, girl. Susanna. Dawn, I'm coming to you.
Thank you so much. And Allison, thank you so much for your reading. Your work is beautiful, and the backstories, like I said, I just love your backstories as well. This is a poem that I wrote a couple years ago. It came out of a workshop that I took during the pandemic with a friend. We called it Monday Zoom School, and it was kind of like a lifeline while we were all in lockdown. And then things started to get a little busier, and I started to miss some of them. And you know, there's always that feeling of like everyone will always be there. And one of them died unexpectedly. And I can still hear her voice when she reads her poems, because she had just this beautiful, bold kind of voice. And she spoke in such beautiful imagery. So this poem is for Marge. How long will it take you to learn that life doesn't wait? Sunflowers bow and you weep at the beauty of nothingness. You run fast and hard through the field. Kick off your shoes and feel the love of summer dirt. That's right, let it bathe your feet, find its way under your toenails. The angels applaud. Wind pushes your hair away from your eyes, trail it behind your body. Feel the energy the closer you get to nowhere. The moon's gone on vacation. You find your way into and through tall green stalks, speaking what you cannot hear. Keep going, straight to the center of the earth. Your broken heart is there. It's patient, waiting for you to pick up sea glass buried where you never expected, cradled in mountains, kissing sky, far inland from salt water. The river turns its eyes on you. You stand at its edge barefoot. You'll never forget the depths of its cold. You always assumed everyone would be there when you returned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Oh, that is wonderful. Look at the chat section, and I try to remind people because I don't want you to miss what people said. And Laura, you are our final poet. Coming to you.
If I can unmute myself.
you're good. You got it.
Okay, great. Hey, everybody. This one's called The Jury Waits. The jury waits while the court officer, who mysteriously crinkles as he walks by, gives them further direction. Without direction, we are rudderless and unbound. A good society follows the rules. We can't sleep during this trial. No rest until the case rests. There is no ease where there is horror, terror, no place for the fanatic that wishes to destroy the crusader. Courtroom benches fill with people, so many parishioners in their pews, waiting to worship at the altar of justice, the right hand of the law, but they are already altered by a loss for which there are no reparations worth having. Thank you.
Ooh, awesome. I don't know why that line mysteriously crinkles as he walks by is going to stick with me among other ones, but I stalled out on that. That sometimes happens. Thank you all for a lovely community and wonderful open mic. And Allison, it was just everything I could hope for to be in your good company. Thank you. All right, guys, be well. And make sure that you saw there was some calls for submissions. I'll give everybody a second if you can copy the chat or anything that you need to. And then also updates on Wild and Precious series, and then Visions International as well. And then also a call for First Literary Review East, poems 16 lines or fewer. So I want to make sure everybody sees what we have. Thank y'all for putting things in the chat section, keeping us connected. Be well.
Thanks, Malika.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for co-hosting.